Alrighty, well, welcome everyone to another episode of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's our first episode of season 3, and it's another one of our All Things Canada edition, and more special, it's our Native Indigenous Lives Matter Indigenous Affairs episode. So it's one of those editions. And I'm so honored by the guests I have with me tonight. I'll be speaking to Nakuset, and Nakuset is the founder of the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, a superb organization which he still runs, which I'm going to ask her in a moment about that. and yeah, we're going to be talking about Indigenous affairs. So first of all, Ms. Nakuset, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I just want to say I'm not the founder of the Native Women's Shelter. I'm the executive director of the Native Women's Shelter. The Native Women's Shelter was created in 1987, and I only joined the team in 1999. So.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. It's just I know your story so well, and a lot of people I know in Canada who are interested in Indigenous affairs, we often know you as the face of that organization, hence why I got confused so much. So my apologies for that, and thank you for the correction. And you can tell how nervous I am at speaking to you today. But thank you for that. But actually, before I get to my first official question, my first unofficial question is actually talk to us about the Native Women's Shelter of Montreal, how it was founded, what the organization is dedicated to doing, what you and your team do on a day-to-day basis. Please enlighten us.
Okay, so obviously I'm currently living in Montreal. I'm originally from Saskatchewan. I'm a Treaty 6 from the Cree Nation. But I've been living in Montreal, and there's a lot of urban people, Indigenous people that come to Montreal for lots of different reasons. And I guess, in the mid-'80s, everyone would sort of show up at the Native Friendship Center that was sort of looking for services. So the Native Friendship Center decided to do a needs assessment because they noticed that Indigenous women would go home with strangers because they had nowhere place to go. So through their needs assessment, the Native Women's Shelter was created. So at the beginning, we've always been in the same location. Mm-hmm. But, when at the beginning they had a few services in terms of supporting women and children. We are the only shelter in Montreal that supports Indigenous women and children. So we have bedrooms, and we have staff that help with referrals, and we have, food and clothing depot and all that. But over the years, we found that we needed to expand our services. So Montreal is a place, or even Quebec is a place where there's an enormous amount of systemic racism. Mm-hmm. And, they did a study 2 years ago. They completed a study called the Viens Commissions. Mm-hmm. On discrimination. And there's 148 recommendations. And these are the challenges that Indigenous women face. And this is why we have so many programs. So when I joined the team, we didn't have any programs, and now I'm managing about 20 different projects. So every time a woman comes in, we try to assess what her needs are. And if there are no appropriate services outside for that, then we create it. So, we have the Ishkwe project on missing and murdered Indigenous women. We have the Cabot Square project. We have the Cabot Square outreach worker. We have, Aboriginal Fridays during the summer. We have an outreach worker for women that have left the Native Women's Shelter and still need support, or who have never come in. We have an addictions worker. We have a family care worker, because so many children are being apprehended into youth protection, and we rarely get our children back. And just recently we bought another building so that we can create a second stage housing for Indigenous women and children. So if you think of the Native Women's Shelter as being the first stage, they come to, where'd you go? Are you still there?
Oh, yeah, I'm still here.
My screen just went black. I don't know why that happened.
Yes, still here.
Okay, so I'll just keep talking and maybe you'll come back.
Go ahead.
Okay, but what I was trying to say is, if you think of the Native Women's Shelter as that first stage, right, where people come in a crisis, once they're out of the crisis, they need a second stage. So we're creating a second stage housing for Indigenous women and children, 23 units. And what we're doing is we're including social pediatrics. So there's an organization called the Dr. Julian Foundation, so that when the women come and stay with us and they're having problems with youth protection and they can't get their kids back, we'll have a clinic downstairs where they can visit the clinic with their child, and then they'll have a team of professionals that will come around and assess the woman and child and find out exactly what she needs and offer that to her. So maybe she needs a doctor or a psychologist or a speech therapist or whatever it is that she needs, they'll supply it. And then as a team, they go back to youth protection and they say, okay, so you expect this woman to have the following, we've provided that. Now, why can't she get her child back? And the thing is that it's really hard for youth protection to amend their ways. So they are currently, they haven't adapted any of the the Vance Commission recommendations or the Laurent Commission or even, a study that we put forward. They're not amending, they're not changing their ways. They're happy with the way things are. And I feel like, I've been at the shelter for 20 years and I don't know how much longer I need to wait for them to change their ways. And I'm like, you know what, guys, forget about it. Just you do what you do. We're going to create something. And what we're doing with this is that we are also offering it to all of Montreal. So it's not just for the women and children that stay at the second stage housing. We're going to open it to all the community. We're going to be like, you having a problem with youth protection? Come and see us. So
when you say when you say that, even say like a black woman who's on the fringes of societies and is being marginalized, would they get helped or no? Just
it would only be for it would only be for Indigenous. Now you have to understand the Dr. Julian Foundation, they have a lot of different services in and around Montreal, but nothing specifically for the Indigenous people. So we are creating our own for Indigenous people, right? And we know that other communities use this service and it works. So this is why we're applying it to the city. We're going to give the women and children like a fighting chance to be together because, since residential school, they've been taking our children away. And then through 60 Scoop, they've been doing it. And now they continue to do it. So, like Cindy Blackstock often says, at the height of residential school, if you times all the children that went by 3, that's how many kids are in youth protection. So we're losing our children at an alarming rate for the most ridiculous reasons. We never get them back. Now we'll get a team, we'll get an army around each mother and child and be like, okay, now we're serious.
Yeah,
so we got to try, right?
Exactly. And we're gonna talk about all of those issues which you just mentioned. And so the first question that my first official question that I like to ask you then is before we get back into current affairs, can you talk to us about what the 60s scoop was, or the 60s Scoop Scandal? And this was Canada's stolen generation. And apart from the intergenerational trauma, how does the legacy of both the 60s Scoop and residential schools live on in other forms in Canada? Because I know officially the 60s Scoop ended in the 80s. The last residential school was only closed in 1996. You already talked about some of the issues, but how do both of those policies still manifest itself in current affairs in Canada?
Well, I mean, that's a long conversation, but when residential schools were created, it was an assimilation policy, right? So originally they felt like if we forced the children And I mean, when they used to come and get the kids, it was like, you give up your children or you go to jail. So it was not, just, hey, there's a school, you want to go? It was forced. Having the Indian agent come into the communities, bringing in a bus or a truck or whatever, and taking the kids. And there's an enormous amount of abuse that went on there. And then obviously, like even today, they talked about 93 children being found in another mass grave, right? So tons of abuse that happened there. When the government was sort of getting pressure to close down these schools, they still felt there was like an Indian problem. And that's when they started implementing the 60s Scoop. So instead of, forcing the kids into residential school, they sent in social workers into communities and into cities and into homes, and they evaluated what they thought was a good sort of home life. Now you have to remember that, there's a lot of communities that don't have services or all the promises that the government said they were going to do. There's communities that don't have, running water or, or proper housing, or there's a lot of things the government was supposed to supply and didn't. So what happens is the social worker would go in and take a look and be like, wow, you have no clean water. You shouldn't have your kids. Like, you're not going to be a good parent if you don't have clean water, or you look lazy, or they would make all different kinds of like sort of stereotypical assessments that were really sort of just, what's difficult is that when we have very, very little and we're trying to sort of move forward in our lives, and then we have like a social worker that comes in and says, no, you're not doing a good job, and then just takes the, the child away. It's not our fault that we're in this situation. Like, if you look at the Indian Act, we were not allowed to leave the reservation until 1960. That's why they had Indian agents, right? So, they put us on these tiny little pieces of land with nothing, promising that they're going to give us more. We don't get more. And then we get penalized when a social worker comes in and says, well, you don't have a toilet, or you don't have, clean water, or you don't have, enough space. So we're going to take your children. So that's what the 60 Scoop is.
Which you're a survivor of.
Yes. So they took at least 20,000 children out of in Canada, but they actually took more children and brought them to the United States. And social workers at that time would get a bonus. So if they were able to find a home in the United States, they got anywhere between $5,000 and $20,000 per child. It's true. Look it up. So So what's different is, at least when you went to residential school, you still knew who your parents were, you knew where your community was. With the 60 Scoop, it was erase everything. Like don't tell the kids they're Native. And it was because it was done in the, in the early 60s and 70s. It was done more through like it was an agreement that all the provinces would be involved. And they would put newspaper clippings up saying, here's a child. They would do commercials. It was really bad. And it was almost like, oh, this poor child, you should do a good thing. It's a good thing if you take this child. But the parents never knew that this was happening. It wasn't a consent thing. It was just take the child. So, I mean, for myself, that was my experience. I was put into foster care with my older sister. And because I was 3 and I was young, I looked adoptable. My sister, who was 6 at the time, did not look adoptable because, she might have had some baggage, and that may not be what, the parents want. And from my experience, in Montreal, there was a Jewish Family Services was the organization that arranged or had the agreement to do the AIM program. That's what it was called, the Adopt an Indian or Métis program. And, my adopted parents had gone to, they didn't think they could have children. So they went to Jewish Family Services and got my brother, who was white. And then they decided they wanted another child, but at that time they had implemented the AIM program. So they had taken the book of children and just only had Indigenous children. So I was like actually in a photo album There was a photo album of all Indigenous children from all over Canada. And they stopped at my picture and they said, hey, we'll take her. So I was flown from Thompson, Manitoba, and brought to Montreal.
Yeah.
Given a different name, being told I wasn't Native, or maybe I was 1/18th Indian or whatever, like just not really telling me anything about my background, and also encouraged to not share who I was, to just sort of assimilate into, the Jewish home and tell people I was Israeli because I look dark. You have to understand, I had a blonde brother and a blonde sister. Tons of questions. People are just like, what? What are you doing in this house?
Wow. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I think you already talked about in the beginning of our conversation about how there are more people, there are more children taken out today under Canada's social care than the entire residential than the entire century of the residential schools and 60s scoops put together, right?
Well, yeah, probably. For sure. Like they said, residential. Well, it's really hard to say the numbers. They say 150,000 people went to residential school. Who's taking numbers? Really? Like at the beginning when they opened, like the turn of the century, no one's taking statistics, plus all those children that are buried, right? So the numbers are really hard. But we know that if you go province by province, usually they have some kind of statistics. You could look at Manitoba and it's something like 90% of the children in care are Indigenous. And there is so many kids that they put them in hotels because they don't even have homes for them,
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, this is, there was that young woman that passed away that was murdered in Winnipeg. Oh, I'm having a blank at her name right now. But she was living in a hotel. Right. And they were just like, stay there and we'll come and visit you. Like the social worker would come and visit you. And she, ended up getting into Fontaine. That was right. I'm trying to remember her name, but you can look at, someone could look it up and remind me. But what happens is, she fell through every single crack. Right. She was seen in a car with an adult, and the police stopped the driver, but never actually said, who's the girl? She looks underage. What's going on? She was given, or she had a drug overdose, went to the hospital. They treated her and just sent her out again. So every, institution failed her, youth protection, the hospital, and the police. And then, she was murdered, and then her murderer actually got off. So there's very few justice for Indigenous people. And specifically here in Montreal, they don't even have the proper numbers.
Ms. Nakuset, are you still there? Uh-oh. Ms. Nakuset, are you there by any chance? All right, sorry about that. Folks. My internet connection got disconnected, so this is this is part two of my conversation with Nakuset. So, Ms. Nakuset, so I was asking you about how the legacy, the intergenerational trauma of the residential schools, the Scoop scandals, like what are the different how does that policy still man itself, how does the 60s Scoop and the residential school policy, how does that still manifest itself today in Canada towards Indigenous people? And you were talking about a woman called Miss
Fontaine.
Yeah. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, and I mean she was a teenager, so and I'm just saying that pardon me.
She was taken from her parents.
No, but no. She's part of the foster care system. So this is something that happened a couple of years ago, where she was put into care, and because there's an enormous amount of children in care and they don't have enough homes for everyone, because she was older, she was about 15. They just decided to keep her in a hotel, and they just assumed that she would just stay in the hotel all day long and not leave. But this is just sort of even though the 60 Scoop is finished, the practices continue, right? And I think that depending on which province you're from, there's very little education about Indigenous anything, history, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I know that, you know, if you go to BC and you get off the plane and you go walk into the airport, you have Indigenous art everywhere. That's not the reality here in Montreal. You know, it's not really in the textbooks where even the students even know how many nations are here. So if you're only getting your education through like, you know, cowboy and Indian movies, you know, you have a real sort of like negative, you know, sort of outlook on Indigenous people. So I think that the social workers already think of us as a problem and you know, are very, have been really difficult with supporting Indigenous families, right? So as an example, I know that one of my staff a couple of years ago brought an Inuk woman to youth protection court. The woman was under the impression that she was getting her child back. Before they walk into court, they sit with the social worker. So my staff is sitting with the woman and the social worker, and they give her the paperwork, and the paperwork has a presenting problem on top, and it says, this Inuk woman is a risk to her child because she is Inuk. So right away, my staff went to go see the judge and said, this is discriminatory. And the judge was like,
I was just about to say, like,
yeah.
I mean, I was just about to say, wow, that's explicitly racist.
Yeah. And the judge saw it and he told them to, you know, to strike that, right? But at the end of the day, she lost her child. And so like the preconceived sort of bias is already there.
Yeah.
A lot of times when they kind of spiral down, right? They have a really difficult time with the reality of losing their children. And then when I went to youth protection with that paperwork, I asked them, I'm like, can someone explain to me who wrote this? And no one would take any accountability. So, you know, I was talking to the upper management and they're like, it's the social workers. And the social workers like, no, it wasn't us. It was the lawyers. And the lawyers like, no, it wasn't. It was the social workers. I never got an answer. But then it made me think, how many other, you know, how many other paperworks have gone forward to the court with the exact same, you know, issue that, you know, an Indigenous woman is a risk to her child because she's Indigenous. So, you know, we tried to do a research at youth protection at Batshaw, and you know, so that we can look into what was going on there. And it was very difficult because we got, I mean, literally the research is called 1 step forward, 2 steps back, because they kind of let us in and then they were like, wait a minute, what are you doing here? No, we're not giving you access to anything. No. We were like, we're publishing the reports. So it's better if you work with us because then you're going to look great afterwards. But that's not the reality. And this is why we have to create our own services, because it's really hard for the institution to change. And I mean, here in you know, in Quebec, I mean, you know, you have, you know, instances where, you know, a woman goes into the hospital because she has, you know, terrible pain, and they assume that, you know, she's a drug addict and talk to her in a horrible way. I mean, I'm referring to Joyce Echaquan, right?
Yeah.
And if she did not record it, then no one would be the wiser. We have to sort of record everything now to prove, like, there's so much racism against us and discrimination, racial profiling, there's so much of it, and yet it doesn't seem like anyone really knows about it. Even, you know, all the cases now where the communities are going to the old residential schools and finding the mass graves, during the TRCs, the survivors
Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So they talked about it. So it's already, you know, shared either, you know, verbally or in the records that there are mass graves. But nobody even like raised an eyebrow back then. Now we see it on TV and everyone's horrified. We're like, guys, we told you about this. But
it's funny. I was also thinking the same thing, because I wasn't surprised to find mass graves. I was more surprised by the response of white multiracial Canada that they were shocked by it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you have to kind of wonder why, right? So maybe if you have like an elderly person that is sharing, their experience of having to literally, dig the graves that some of them had, it's sort of like, I don't really want to hear it. But when you show a scene that looks like a football field full of, little flags, like 800 flags, that image jars you more. So I'm not sure what it is, but I think that we also need accountability at this point, right? Because, it was the government and the churches that created the residential schools. Whoever dug that first grave had to get authority and approval from someone. And we're talking about, certain places are 93, certain places are 215, certain places are 851. That's a lot of graves. That's a lot of approvals. There are records. And I think that what we need is for, honestly, I would just love it if someone were to do something like the Nuremberg trial for Indigenous people, to have some kind of trial and bring people, all the, the teachers and the nuns and the priests and the Indian agents all out to be like, who did this? What did you see? What did you, were you part of this? And yeah.
I completely agree. I completely agree with you on that. And going back to the going back to the 60 Scoop, and I apologize in advance if this is a stupid question. If this is a stupid question, but I have to ask it. Did most of the Indigenous children who were forcibly adopted to white families, did most of them experience racism and the deep anguish you went through? Because I know, and yeah, actually answer that first before I ask my follow-up question.
Yeah, I mean, there's this really great book called Stolen from Our Embrace by Ernie Cray and Suzanne Fournier. And in their book, it's all about the 60 Scoop. And in their book, they say 85% of the adoptions failed. So that means that, the children had a negative experience. They ran away, they died. They just had a really bad. So that means only 15% went well. I fall in the 85.
Wow. Unbelievable. And yet it still happens. And yet it still happens today. It still happens today. Indigenous children forcibly taken away from their families, right? And put into these and put into, like adoption homes and foster families, right?
Yeah, it's still happening today, right? So we see it often. We see like a lot of the women that come into the Native Women's Shelter with their children are mandated by Youth Protection to be there. Basically, they're saying if you're not at the Native Women's Shelter, we're separating you and your child, and that's it. So we're there for that purpose. And then this is why we need to have the second stage housing where they can continue to live for up to 3 years and then have an army of professionals around them. So every time Youth Protection is like, oh, how come you didn't go see, we told you that you can't get your kids back unless you see, an addictions worker and you have 6 months to do it. But the reality is the waiting list is so long that you're setting them up to fail, which is why if we see the mandate and it looks like overwhelming for the mom, we're like, no worries. You need this, that. And then we pull in all the professionals and like, we're there. And then you go in. And when you bring those professionals into Youth Protection, then they're going to be a little bit more like, oh, wait a minute. It's going to throw them. But that's what we need to do. We need to support the women and child and bring the families back together, because really it's not a reality to get the kids back.
Exactly. And then I have to a quick follow-up then is in your personal story, why do you think your adopted grandmother, who you call your Bubba, had this beautiful empathy and compassion towards you?
My Bubby, not my Bubba.
Bubby.
Yeah, that's Yiddish for grandmother. I don't know. I mean, she just thought was like the best thing ever. She just adored me from the time I came in. And, you know, maybe there's a couple of reasons. One of like what we had in common is that I was, you know, adopted into a Jewish family and I had to convert. Well, my bubby did also. When she married into the family, she was Christian and she had to convert. So, and then I had another aunt that had the same experience. So we all sort of got treated as we were called the converts. So I think that she, you know, sort of living already in the family before I arrived, already saw the weird kind of dynamics that were going on. And then when I arrived, and so she witnessed the kind of treatment I was getting, and she was really like, oh my God, this poor kid. Like, I know I have a lived experience that's similar, and she's so young, and I'm going to do everything I can to, you know, show her that, you know, she's loved and adored. And she really was. I mean, you know, she's that person that every time I walked into the room, her eyes would light up. She'd be so happy to see me. That was the only person that ever did that in my family. Everybody else was like, oh God, she's back. So, yeah.
Unbelievable. Well, and may she, may her campfires burn forever. I have my friends Robert and Selena Eggington. They're of the Noongar people of Western Australia. I'm wearing the Aboriginal flag because because I know for a fact there's going to be lots of protests going on to cancel Australia Day. Mm-hmm. And you know, one of their old sayings is, may our campfires, you know, burn forever, when they talk about, you know, Aboriginal people that have lost. So I would say that's your adoptive grandmother as well. So, and so then I have can you do you it's obvious because I was going to ask you if you think that if you think most of the adoption agencies are rooted in racism, and do you and I think you already answered that if such a that. Well, okay. Well, I'll just ask again. Do you think most adoption agencies in Canada are rooted in racism? And do you think that if such a system needs to be in place, then Indigenous people should be in care of other Indigenous people? And if the answer is yes, and again, stupid question, why do you think so?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a blanket statement, right? I don't know if every single adoption agency is racist, right? I think that what we find are most Canadians are uneducated in our history, and that was done purposely. Like, the government doesn't want to tell people about the digging of the graves or the stealing of the land, or, you know, the smallpox and, you know, and the bay blankets that they put around us. Like, we have a really horrible history that's rooted in discrimination and racism, and it's in all the institutions, right? The police are known for doing the starlight tours, right? I mean, we're literally, you know, sort of racially profiled here in Montreal. You know, the latest report is that Indigenous women are 11 times more likely to be racial profiled than any other race. Like, great, good for us. But what's anyone doing about it, right? So if people aren't educated, and if they don't know where we came from and the difficulties we've had, and the generational trauma that we've had, you know, the loss of language, loss of culture, loss of land, loss of everything. And again, if they're getting their education from cowboy and Indian movies, right, that's a problem. So I think education is the problem. And, you know.
Or the miseducation.
Yeah, the miseducation.
The miseducation.
The lack of education, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whenever we go to court, like for everything, like Tina Fontaine lost, you know, Colton Boushie lost, you know, like even with you know, Joyce Echaquan, I mean, it was basically just a slap on the wrist, right? Like, it's nothing. Like, there's very little accountability. And I think that and even with all these mass graves, like how come there's not like sort of an outcry that, you know, mass murder as opposed to, you know, unmarked graves? It sounds so much more polite than what it really is. So, yeah, I think that's what it is. I think people need to be more empathetic and I don't know. I mean, it's amazing we're still here. Like, they did everything to try to kill us, and we're still here. So I think we need more allies. And what was your other question? You said you had two questions.
Yeah, that's you know, that if an agency like adoption agencies are are to exist, shouldn't it be shouldn't a child be given to an Indigenous family as opposed to as opposed to what happened to you and countless others in the '60s Scoop and even now?
Well, I mean, ideally, yes, it would be an Indigenous family, right? And I think that, here in Montreal, we were trying to do that. We were trying to get foster homes that were run for having foster parents that are Indigenous and only having those foster kids that are Indigenous there, so they would see a familiar face, a familiar history. I mean, we're all different nations and we all have different histories, but we have the colonialism in common, and we've all suffered some way. So I think that is something that should happen. But I think that currently, like, why aren't we interviewing people properly before you take an Indigenous child? I actually said that to Bacha. I'm like, we could do a video. Before you take this Indigenous child, there are some things you should know, and just give them a video about
you have like a racial sensitivity class or something, or
yeah, but also, why are you taking this child? What do you know about the child's culture? Where are they from? What's the reservation? What are the this? What kind of, what are the ceremonies? What are you going to do to enrich this child's, life in their culture? Who are you going to reach out to? Who are what are the supports? Like, yeah. Anyways, they won't let me do it, but I would love to interview people to be like, it's an honor to receive one of these children. How are you going to, fulfill this, enrich this child's life, as opposed to, here's a little savage, good luck with that, right? Like, I have like a colleague of mine that runs an Indigenous daycare, and she says that some of the comments that the foster parents drop off about their children, it's like, oh yeah, he's really dirty, but he's Inuit. What? Or he's really violent, but he's Inuit. I'm like, what is that? That's how you talk to the other the people who work with the children? How do you talk to your children? Like, that's a problem. And the thing of trying to do trainings for all the foster parents, we were so close to doing it, and then they got unionized, and then all of a sudden it's you can't get in, right? So this is why we have to create our own services, because it's so hard to change the institutions. And if you put so much effort into changing the institutions, it's like, you're running into a wall, and you can do that for a couple of years, but what's the point? They have to it's almost the allies that have to put the pressure on the institutions about why they're not doing better. In the hospital, are there any other cases like Joyce Echequan? Has anyone looked into it? Has there been any complaints about that? Have you had any training working with Indigenous people, sensitivity? Can we check your biases? Same thing with the police, right? Like, because the police have such a problem with Indigenous people, I wanted them to do a training. There was a training, that's another story, but the training was canceled. But they're talking about doing more training with, about Indigenous people and their histories. And I was thinking, after you finish the training, they need to do 2 exams, one written to make sure they actually, was able to sort of, understand. They were listening, they understood the information. Here's an exam like any other course you would take, in university. You have to take an exam. The police should take an exam. But so one part is the written, the other part's an oral. So you're going to have to meet 2 elders and explain to them, do an oral presentation about what you learned. And those elders are going to tell you whether or not you're full of it, and then right? And then if you fail, then they'll be like, this is the next step you have to take in order to, prove that you have sensitivity towards Indigenous people.
That's a perfect segue. And you already talked about institutional racism in Quebec. And so talk to us more then about the institutional racism in Quebec, specifically towards Indigenous people. And can you talk about the difficulties when it comes to calling out racism in Quebec? And the reason why I ask that is because I know Quebec is a country within a country when we talk about Canada, because the francophones, the settler colonialist francophones, they were discriminated against by by the Anglophones, but they both sort of worked together when it came to when it came to the dispossession of Indigenous people and the ongoing marginalization of Indigenous people. And I know often, Quebecers, they get very defensive when you call them out on their racism, or they'll say things like you're singling out Quebec for institutional racism. And they'll use that history of when, Anglophone Canada discriminated against them. So how difficult is it when it comes to, when it comes to speaking out against institutional racism in Quebec?
Well, you got to be brave to do it, right? It's not like everyone who's able to do it, and it all depends on who's experiencing it, right? So, like at the Native Women's Shelter, whenever a client needs to go to a doctor, lawyer, whatever, we always have someone who accompanies them, because it's usually the staff that will pick up on the tone. When you're receiving the racism, you kind of freeze and you're not sure what to do about it. Whereas, the staff that's working with you can pick it up and she can question and she can write a report. I mean, I literally have paperwork at the shelter called incidences for outside occurrences for racism. So it's a checklist. It's so bad that it's a checklist. So if you're going to go to the hospital, here's one, but it'll work if you go to, welfare, or if you work for the court or whatever. And it has like little boxes about, if it's like, verbal or whatever. And what we do is at the end of the form, we write down the person's name who was acting that way. And then we ask them for their supervisor, and then we write their name down, and then we send it to them. When you get it in writing, that's the only thing that works. If you're like, oh, she was racist, it's like, well, my word against her word and blah, blah, blah. But when they get it in writing, it changes everything. And we had an instance where there was an Inuk woman wanted to go to a treatment center for drug rehabilitation, and one of our staff went, and she was so mistreated and she knew she was going to be mistreated. She told the counselor before, or the staff member, she's like, this is not going to be good. I feel it. And sure enough, the staff member was horrified by what she saw. I mean, the person was saying, I would like to stop doing drugs. And the doctor would saying, I don't know. Are you sure you really want to stop doing drugs? And then he would wink at my staff. So she never got treatment. He basically refused treatment, saying that, why don't you come back if you're really sure you want to, stop doing drugs. We never saw her. Like, she left. She was so upset. But my staff came to me and she was actually crying. And I was like, get out that paperwork, fill it out, send it. And when we did that, that institution received it and was horrified. And what we did was we had a conversation with them, and then we did sensitivity training to their organization. And then they came to our organization and did a training on information and awareness about drugs and all that. So we actually got closer by doing that. But seriously, we have to catch people in the act in order. Okay, if that works, it works, but it's a real sad state of affairs. So, I mean, it happens everywhere. And here in, what's hard is that here in Quebec, we have a premier, the guy who's sort of like in charge, and he doesn't believe in systemic racism. He says it doesn't happen.
I was just about to say. I was just about to say, because you have François Legault of the Coalition Avenue du Quebec. Last year. It was last year. Yeah, last year at the height of all of the mass protests against against systemic racism towards Indigenous people, the discovery of all of those murder scenes, the unmarked graves. François Legault said that there's no systemic racism in Quebec, and François Blanchette of the the Quebec Bloc also said that there's no institutional racism in Quebec. That's a Canada problem. What I thought was so shocking, though, about both of their comments was several months before that, or I think sometime the year before that, Francois Legault actually, went to the Quebec Assembly and actually apologized for centuries and decades of systemic racism in Quebec. And even Francois Blanchette, when he's on those prime minister debates, he's always saying, we respect Indigenous people. They are a nation just like Quebec is a nation. And then they go and do a complete 180 by saying, we're not going to celebrate Orange Shirt Day. No, there's no systemic racism in Quebec.
Yeah. And that's what was really hard too, is because they, at least for the Legault government, he always denies it, even though he has the Viens Commission's report, right? I'm always, I get interviewed a lot. So, I'll always say, why don't you read it? Or if not, you can just press play. You can watch it. I mean, I was there and I testified for 3 days, right? So, it's there. Like, obviously, you're not even looking at the reports, right? And what we're asking you to do is just try to make some changes. But it seems like it's really hard for them to make changes. They don't want to, I got to change. So that's what's difficult. But then what happens is, like, this year, it was the federal government decided that September 30th would be National Reconciliation Day, right? So it's considered a holiday. So we have, our prime minister who's like, nah, we got enough holidays, nah. So he completely ignored it, right? So he minimizes it.
Yeah.
And then we have the, Prime Minister Trudeau, who goes on vacation when he was supposed to go visit, some residential school survivors. So you have the provincial and the federal government who are saying this is an important day, but their actions speak louder than words. They are walking away. They are minimizing that. Anyways, I did a rally.
Yeah.
I was very vocal. I'm like, well, you don't want to acknowledge it, but lots of people do want to acknowledge it, and children need to know about this. And, it's really the kinds of, I guess, obstacles that are in our way are multiple, and yet we still try to find a way to get through it. And instead of having a government that is offering help,
both provincially and federally, right?
Yeah, it's sticking its head in the sand, pretending that it doesn't happen. I mean, I remember there was another woman named Chantal Moore, and they did a wellness check. The police were called to do a wellness check on her, and then they ended up shooting her a couple of times and killing her. So when that happened, I remember the federal, the Indian Affairs guy was like, or Indigenous Services Canada, was outraged. He went on, he talked to the media about being outraged about this. I'm like, you're outraged? Like, wait a minute, let's have a conversation. Because if you're really outraged, then you'll do something to change. And I had a meeting with him and a whole bunch of chiefs, and we were like, listen, you could be that Indigenous services guy that actually helps Indigenous people. And if you really are outraged by this, then you can change the behavior. And we can try to provide some training for all the RCMP, all the SQ, all the, like the police in Montreal, the SPVM, like, we can provide training. We already have all these documents, all these trainings. We can do it. You could lead us. And he's like, not my job. No, that's Ralph Goodall. That's and he'll call you. And I'm like, still haven't received a call. So sometimes I go into these meetings and I'm like, what just happened? Because it's hard to get people to change, and it doesn't feel like it's hard. Like, I mean, you got the people that have the knowledge and the will to help the change. It's receiving it. It's sort of like, no, I'm not ready for that. Anyway.
That's unbelievable. And my next question is actually one moment. There's a problem with my 1 second. Problems with my Microsoft Word. Let me get that out again. Oh, come on. Jeez, I'm having all this. Okay, here it is. Sorry about that, Miss Nakuset. My Microsoft Word got all blurry for a moment. Okay. Wait. I was right. Okay. Yeah. Well, you already alluded to this. I want to know what's the latest in the legal action and justice groups doing regarding the hospital in Quebec, which was found guilty of racism and the gross negligence of the Indigenous woman you talked about who died under their care and was grossly mistreated. And I imagine that's just an example of a long history of medical racism that First Nations and Inuit people go through, right?
Yeah, I mean that community is it's near the Atikamekw community where she passed away, and apparently they are having conversations in terms of they have sort of like an Indigenous liaison worker that is now in that hospital, and they're supposed to be doing training, and the community the community is called Manwan, where Joyce was from. They seem to be saying that things are getting better. Now, what's weird is that after Joyce passed away, there was another Atikamekw woman that went in and was mistreated as well. And the nurses actually said, "You remember what happened to Joyce?" So it's difficult because it almost feels like they just need to sort of like clean out all the staff that are there and just replace them with new ones, because it's really hard to teach people, like if you have a bias, then this is not your place. If you are supposed to, do no harm and you're choosing to do harm, this is not the place for you. But I don't know if you have a Legault government who says, oh no, it's just a couple of, rotten apples, but the reality is that it's more, then you just, sort of change everything. And I mean, honestly, like there are ways you can force people to do things, by their contracts, right? So, I mean, if people really wanted to sort of change the system, like if who's ever in charge of that hospital, if they were serious about it, I mean, even the community of Manwan, they created like a document called Joyce's Principle. So what they want is for all the hospitals to adopt it, and it's best practices working with Indigenous people. And, some hospitals actually picked it up, but a lot of them, it's like, well, we don't have to, so we're not going to. But for those, especially that particular hospital, if they were to change the contracts and saying, listen, these are the recommendations, and you have X amount of time to sort of, create like a plan of action and how you're going to operate, and then we're going to evaluate, and if it doesn't work out, you're fired. Then there's the pressure to do it, right? Exactly. People want to keep their jobs, right? But that's what you have to do, is you have to write it into their contracts and say, we take this seriously. Since Joyce Echaquan passed away, we believe that, Indigenous people should be treated in a good way. And therefore, all the contracts that are amended, you all have to go for training. You all have to get the exam, and speak to the members of Manwan, like find some community members, do your oral presentation there, and then you'll know. Because really, I remember I did a training with the police, and we did the blanket exercise, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it, because it forces you to feel, and if you feel something, then you might change, and they weren't willing to change. So they were kind of like, I don't hear anything, I don't feel anything, I'm gonna stay with the status quo. But yeah, it's not easy.
And that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, what other forms of policing and police brutality are a constant reality for Indigenous people? And are most Indigenous people, now because Indigenous people are widely represented in the prison population, and are most Indigenous people in prison for the pettiest of reasons, like nonviolent offenses such as consuming illegal drugs, or a disturbance which got out of hand due to police involvement? And I'm curious, where do you stand on policing? Are you for abolitionism or reforms, and why one or the other?
You ask a lot of questions. Okay, listen, I'm not an expert on what's going on in the judicial system.
Yeah.
What I know is that there's something called Gladue reports. And this is something that all the lawyers are supposed to do when they are about to sentence someone who's Indigenous. And it's the law. All the lawyers are supposed to do this. They rarely do it. What happens is Indigenous people get the training themselves and they offer it to the clients through like native parajudicial services, right? But I mean, what it is looking at someone's history through colonialism and how it's affected them, and then the judge reads the report and then actually sentences them accordingly. So if this part, which is actually the law, is ignored, for sure you have so many more people in jail. And the thing is that we sometimes we meet people that are having issues with their lawyers, and there's this one person who said, oh, I was told that it's going to cost $5,000 in order for the lawyer to fill out the Gladue report. That's illegal. It's funded. You're asking your poor client to give you $5,000 to do a report. So we always have to be on alert about these things. But I mean, Indigenous people are racially profiled. So yes, I mean, jaywalking or whatever, like sitting on a park bench for too long, loitering, I mean, everything. So yes, and there's an enormous amount of people that are in the prison system, and sometimes they call it the next residential school because there's so many. But there needs to be more programming, and the lawyers need to do better. I mean, that's the first thing I ask when I meet a lawyer is like, do you do Gladue reports? You don't? I want to talk to you. Like it's your job to do it, right? So so I don't know about abolishing the police. I mean, I know that there's the sort of, this whole movement about, not having police as empowered as they are. But I don't know if that's something that's in Quebec. I don't see that happening because I know that the mayor just gave a huge raise. The budget for the police is even bigger than it was last year when all this, all these issues came and all these like sort of rallies came about to sort of defund the police, right? What we need is, we could have police, but police need to be better trained. And for sure, we need more resources when it comes to sensitivity. Because like where I work, there was, I work around, there's another shelter called Resilience Montreal. So that's something that I started, and now it's David Chapman that runs it. But about 2 years ago, there was a woman that was really, really in distress, and I've known her like since I started my career. And David sat with her for like 4 hours just listening to her, and she was suicidal. And after the 4 hours, he said, can I call an ambulance? And she said yes. And what happened was we got like 7 police cars and a dog unit that showed up. So when we talk about racial profiling, when they spoke
actually, sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure I got that right. So here's this woman in distress, very suicidal. Your colleague sat with her, managed to calm her down, but when he sent out for help, somebody to put her in a safe space, instead what she got was the police.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So that freaked her out because she's like, what did you do? Like, I trusted you. Why are there police here? It's like, I called for an ambulance, right? But what happens is when you talk about racial profiling, he mentioned her name. Well, she was in the system. So like, just send the police. It's not, like they minimized her crisis and decided it was something else. And, because he was there, he was able to calm her down because she got really, really agitated when she saw. I mean, they brought the dog unit, the canine unit. So you have the dogs barking, and, that's not what she needed. She was in a moment of, yes, I'm ready to go to the hospital for treatment, and then receiving this, it just triggers everything. And we really, I wrote a letter, I sent it to the mayor, nothing has ever been resolved. So I think that, it's really hard to trust the police right now. And that it's up to them to change it. Same thing, it is up to youth protection. Like, it would be nice for youth protection to be like, we'd like to acknowledge that we've done an enormous amount of damage and we've ripped up families and we've done this, we've done that, and this is what we're going to do to make it better. Let's work together. It's like they need to send out an olive branch to say, we acknowledge that we've done some really crappy things, but we're willing to move forward, and this is our plan. But no one's doing that. They're just sweeping it under the rug. Like, oh, it never happened. Maybe she's not going to mention it again. And, it's
Miriam Haddad, who ran for leadership of the Green Party of Canada, and then people like Al Jones, Pamela Pomader, and Robin Maynard, a lot of them would say that the police were founded to be the racist thugs that a lot of them are. So there is no reforming them. But would you say that while it would be nice to have a world where we're not constantly policed, we need to focus more on just reforms, like getting rid of like something like the drug war, and have Indigenous communities empowered or community control over the police?
I don't know. The thing is that I remember when I spoke to, Mark Miller about, what was happening with Chantal Moore and trying to make changes. One of the recommendations was, why don't you use like the tribal police, right? Like Ganawage has their own police force. Why don't you have the police, that police force, train your police force so that, and again, we have to check for biases, right? I think people need to be accountable for their behavior. Because those that, don't pass, if you're really a thug, we'll find out. And then you're going to have to leave, right? But there's also like that new generation of police that are like in training. They need to be thoroughly trained in a good way. So they're not coming in with the old sort of, outlook on. I remember talking to a police officer and he was calling our people deterrents. I'm like, no, sorry, irritants. I was like, talking about us? For irritants? Like, not you, you're a good one. Oh, come on. Like, but that's the sort of way that they think. But I'm hopeful that there will be a change, but there's not going to be a change unless you demand change. And the way you do it is holding people accountable. But it's not just me to hold, it's got to be the leadership holding the people in the force accountable and making sure that they're getting, that their bias is checked, the proper training, the sensitivity, and then, and again, the exams to find out, that's the only way to see whether or not people are full of it. I'm sure one or two will slip through, but, I think that's what you got to do.
And what's currently briefly, what's currently going on with the murdered and missing Indigenous women? Like what's happening with that? Is there any progress as to finding out a lot of the perpetrators, or like what's happening with that?
Well, the Native Women's Shelter has the Ishwe project. So this is a project that we've had for the last 4 years where we have two staff. One is the coordinator and the other is a research worker. Because we've had it for 4 years, Jessica, who's been leading it, every time a family needs support because a woman goes missing, they just know to call her directly. All the police are supposed to have all of Jessica's information about the Ishwe project, so that if a woman comes into or a family comes into a police station to say, hey, my family went missing, the police have to refer the family to Jessica, because like a lot of times, like, people don't feel comfortable talking to the police. And that is, what happened with Robert Picton was like a perfect example, because they're like, oh, she's on a bender, she'll come back, whatever. And then, a lot of Indigenous women were murdered through him. So we already have like this bias. The police have this bias against us that they don't really believe that our women are missing. So what we try to do with the project is give people the option. You don't want to talk to the police, you come to us. And when you come to us, we will set up a three-way call with the police to make sure that your report is actually filed and that they're on the case. And then we'll follow up 24 hours later. And then we'll support you by giving you whatever resources and psychological support that you need. And then we'll help you if there's a trial or if there's whatever. So, I mean, the Ishkwe project, I think there were like 60 missing women since the beginning of the project. And I think they found about 56 of them. So they're able to find the women, and working with the police is sort of an ongoing struggle. Even though we signed an agreement with the police, it was sort of ignored for a while, and then it took a year for them to sort of take it seriously again. So it's something that we're continuing to sort of push forward. And also, we have someone who's working on statistics so that we can really understand what is it like in Quebec. What are the numbers? Because there are no statistics around here. So we have someone who's creating a database. And then like in Montreal on February 14th, we're going to be doing a march. So what we're going to do is, walk down the street, but have some really incredible speakers that are going to come and share their thoughts on missing and murdered. So Jessica will speak, and Janice, the researcher, will speak, and Ellen Gabriel, who's like incredible. And, the new president of Quebec Native Women, Marjolaine, will also speak. So they'll all give their own perspectives about missing and murdered Indigenous women and what they, a lot of people want to know about it, but they don't have enough information. So that's what we're going to offer. We just have to keep it going. Like we literally put up a 1-800 number. So if you're not comfortable calling the police because, you have a family member that disappeared, you call the 1-800 number, you leave a message, and then we'll call you back, and we'll either, call the police and file the report on their behalf. Because let's say, maybe they have a bad history with the police and they have a warrant or whatever, I don't know what, and that's why they're not calling. Don't worry, we're allowed to be that sort of third party to make the report. And also if you have a tip about someone, because a lot of times when women go missing, it's the Indigenous people that find them, right? They're like, oh, wait, through Facebook, they're like, no, I saw her on this street, that street. So the police are kind of like, they're out the door and they're like, oh, she was found, okay. So this is why we're using like a 1-800 number, and we launched it in the spring, and it's Canada-wide. So we had it like on, billboards and in metros and all that. So yeah, so you have to just sort of, encourage people to, to call us instead of making that police their first phone call, because again, the police need to do more work in sort of repairing. You have to remember, when we were taken from residential school, it was the RCMP that was like one of the first jobs, was to first push us onto reservations, and then afterwards go to the reservations and take the children and force them to residential schools. We have this huge history of tension with the police. So unless they do something to repair it, it's not going to get any better, but we can try.
I'm almost done with my questions. Don't worry.
Good. It's late.
I'm almost done with my questions. So then very briefly, I want to ask you, what to you is self-determination, and what to you is self-determination and land back?
You're asking the wrong Indian. I'm sorry, but I was adopted, right? I don't, I'm not from my community, right? I mean, I'm from my community, but I've never lived, I'm from Lac La Ronge, Saskatchewan. I don't speak my language. So, and I don't really, I'm not the right person for that question because I'm urban. I live in the city. So, I mean, I know that, if I think Ganawagi should get their land back because that's the Mohawk community here. And I know that Gunasatagi should because the government keeps taking more and more. I mean, that's why we know of Ellen Gabriel because they wanted to, turn their cemetery into a golf course. And they were like, that's where they had the whole Oka crisis, right? So
yes, that which happened yours truly Montreal, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that, what Ganawagi used to be, like the communities, like they've shrunk. And I think that the government will always keep trying to take more. So I believe in the idea of land back. I think people should give their land back and go into the museums and take all our art and everything else back. And, like there's a lot that needs to happen. But, I'm not, I'm more of an urban person. So I just work on the issues that I see in the city. So sorry.
And what do you think of this? Now, I had Jay Watts of the Communist Party of Canada on my program a while ago. And when I asked him, what would the Communist Party, do to address the grievances of Indigenous people? And he talked about how if that was to happen, he would give, the party would give Indigenous communities the right to secede from the Canadian Federation. And I'm just curious, like, what do you think about that? Like, would that be the kind of justice you would like to see for Indigenous people?
I don't really understand what that means. Secede? Like what? Like what? What do you mean? Like do we get our land back? What does that mean? Everyone leaves Canada? Goes away and then we get to I don't know what that means, right?
Yeah, basically I think restoring nationhood back to the Indigenous community, and if they want to be part of this thing called Canada, okay, but of course we completely get rid of all the Indian Act, all forms of institutional racism. Or if the Indigenous community wanted to be a nation again and not be part of Canada, secedes, it be granted to them.
Yeah, I'm not the right person to ask about that because I mean, every community and every nation has a different agreement with the government. Some of them already see themselves as autonomous. I don't know enough about that to really answer, right? But I mean, if sometimes people are like, you should be a politician, and I'd be like, okay, I'm a politician, bring the boat, everyone get back on. I think that so much has been taken away from us, and we really need to regain everything. And it's overwhelming, everything. Like I said, I don't speak my language. I speak more Hebrew than I speak Cree. That's really sad. So when am I going to have time to learn my language? When am I going to have time to learn how to, live off the land? I don't fish. I don't, I'm not self-sufficient. I mean, I'd be one of those people that would freeze to death. Like, I don't know how to live off the land. And then there's, everything else from the culture that I'm not aware of. I don't know about my history and the storytelling. There's a lot of our rights.
So for you, is it sort of like the idea of abolishing the police? Like it's a nice idea. Sure, I would love to sign up for it, but realistically, it's better to fight for reforms and as a route to self-determination.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know necessarily in Ganawagi if they're having that conversation about defunding the police, right? They might be okay with the police that are there. I think it's sort of like, defund the racist police, right? Police are still gonna, I mean, if I get mugged, who am I gonna call, right? So unfortunately, I will have to call the police. They do have a certain purpose, but they definitely have been, abusive with their power. So I think that needs to be addressed. And I definitely think that, what we learned with, the situation where we had, 7 cop cars and a, canine unit, that there needs to be more sensitivity and training and support for when we make those phone calls, that we would have someone come down who's maybe, a healthcare worker or social worker or something like that instead of police cars. I think there needs to
But
be
even they have
some
to go.
reform.
Even they have to go through the kinds of trainings you would like to see the police do, because as you mentioned, there's lots of racism in the
Everywhere. Yeah,
welfare, social cares
yeah,
system,
yeah.
school system.
Like, yeah, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do. So, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. It's just that you have to have the will. And this is where those that are, sometimes I feel like I'm not effective because it's like, oh, it's her again. Oh, she's blah, blah, blah. But if other people, are in tune with different organizations, whether hospitals or youth protection or with the police or whatever, lawyers, they can share the information and ask questions like, why would you say something like that? Why do you act that way? Why do you have these assumptions? Why do you have these biases? Like, they can challenge their institutions and their friends to do better, right?
Yeah. And second to final question. My second to final question. My second to final question is the Indian Act. Now the far right politician Maxime Bernier, he said that if he was in power, he would just abolish the Indian Act. And I'd like to ask, why? I mean, I would love to see the Indian Act abolished, but why is it not so simple to just abolish the Indian Act? Because a lot of people say that you can't just abolish the Indian Act. And why do you think that is?
I don't really know that much. Like, I don't about it in terms of like, there's changes to the Indian Act all the time, right? So like what it used to be originally and what it is now has been changed. I know that, I have, like, there's certain sort of funding and programs that happen through being a status Indian like I am. So, if I want to get services for my kids, it's free. So because I have my Indian status, I get, free eyeglasses, and I get my teeth cleaned, and, I get post-secondary education, and, a living allowance, and, I get $5 a year for being an Indian. I get the treaty money. That's never gone up, by the way, since like 1876. But anyways, so but if I need services for my kids, I can like tap into Jordan's principle and make sure that my kids have, speech therapy or tutors or whatever it is that they need. So if you get rid of all, like, before they get rid of all that, they should ensure that we still have some kind of being an Indigenous person, we should still have some of these benefits. Because basically, my chief, in 1876 or 78, signed an agreement with the Queen that they would basically give up the land, and these were the benefits, right? And I think that it needs to be renegotiated. There was a time when the Indian Act said that, if you go to residential school, you're disenfranchised. You're no longer an Indigenous person. You don't have any rights. You don't have the land. You can't become a lawyer. You can't, like, there's, like I said, it's changed a lot. But I'm happy that, like, I made the conscious decision to, have children and have children with someone who was Cree, so that all the kids have their Indian status, and that, when they want to go to university, and they're going to go to university, that it's going to be, it's going to be free for them, right? Like, we can have that. So, yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
Sounds to me like
Someone
Canada. Sounds to me like Canada and all of those Indigenous nations need to have a rewrite and so forth. And now, before I let you go, Ms. Nakuset, I usually always ask my guests this questionnaire, and this is my final thing before I let you go. It'll be much more quicker than the other questions. So before I let you go, Ms. Nakuset, what is your favorite words?
I don't know. My favorite words?
Yeah, favorite word.
Leave me alone. No, that's not a word. I like the word dégueulasse. I don't know why. It means disgusting in French.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just sounds pretty dégueulasse, but it's not even English.
What's your least favorite word?
No. I love it. Like when people say no to me, I'm like, just try it. Just try. So maybe no is my favorite word then. I don't know. No, I really like dégueulasse. Let's go with dégueulasse.
And no being your least favorite.
Yeah.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Kind of like synergy, right? Like working with people that are creative, and brainstorming, getting ideas, and being around people that are really passionate, you know, because that's why, I mean, I do a gazillion things. Like I don't just do my job. Like I'm doing all these, I'm doing all, and I'm not even a photographer. I'm like getting people to do all these things. I feel almost like a bit of like an Indian Andy Warhol, you know, everybody else is kind of doing the work. And I'm just like, this is what we should do. You do it. Oh, I love it. It's great. Thank you. So yeah, but that idea of like working with people and then the ideas flow and then things happen, because I'm really good at getting a concrete idea and following it through all the way. Awesome. So I guess, you know, working with creative people, synergy.
What turns you off?
Oh, I don't know what the word is for it, but you have people that are like really negative and that always like want to pull you down, kind of like crab in the bucket, right? I don't get it. And I think that, you know, for especially
so pessimism and people who are just like and people who just like wake up pessimistic and just want to, and even when there's like a little bit of like a light, they find a way to dampen it.
Yeah, and that, you know, those that kind of like have the intention to like I don't know, sort of cut you down, right? Like if you're doing something really good and then someone is like, you don't know what you're doing, and try to discredit and stuff like that. Like, but I mean, I think they also call that lateral violence, right? Where, you know, instead of having a conversation and having a different opinions, they'll just, you know, gossip or, you know, and I think that's lateral violence is definitely an issue that happens. But I find that hard. Like I'm always very there's always a solution, there's always a way, and then having those that are just, you know, from the completely different sort of point of view that everything's crap and everyone's bad and everyone is negative and that person's terrible, and I'm like, get away.
What is your favorite curse words?
Motherfucker.
What sound or noise do you love?
I like the sound of the ocean.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Sounds of despair, whether it's children crying or people that are like hurt physically, that, you know, like yeah.
And what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you like to what profession other than yours would you like to attempt?
I feel like I'm doing everything, right? So I'm kind of like, you know, I'm the executive director, but I'm also, you know,
Poetry.
I thought you said this would be easy. This is not easy. You know? I don't know. I wish I was more creative. Like I'm creative in a way where I have an idea and then I find creative people to do it, but like I can't draw, you know, and I can't sing, you know, and I can't, well, I used to be able to dance until I broke my foot, but, you know, I don't know.
So something in the art world then, or anything.
Something in the art world. Yeah, something in the art world. for sure. But
And what would and what would you absolutely not ever? What's a job that you would never want to do under any circumstances?
I'd never want to be a coroner.
You mean a mortician or a coroner who's okay?
Anyone working with dead bodies.
Yeah,
you wouldn't want to do that, and I wouldn't want to. Yeah, no, I don't know how the people do it. How do you like view dead bodies all the time? Like, doesn't that just freak you out? Like, yeah, exactly. I wouldn't want to do that.
And then the final question: if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You must be so tired. But I would hope to see my sister. I would hope to see my sister when I go, and my bubby, when I go through the pearly gates. I don't need to see God so much, but I'd like to see, I don't know. Because we're different. We're like creator, right? We're not really, I don't know, it's a Christian thing, right? The pearly gates. But yeah, I'd like to see those family members that have passed on, and I feel like their spirits are still with me and are still supporting me. And yeah.
Well, Miss Nakuset, I just want to thank you so much for taking precious time out of your busy day to be on 1+1. It was a real honor to speak to you. I hope I get the chance to speak to you again in the future. And again, this is a real honor to speak to you. As you can see, a lot of times I was very nervous. And I think even my laptop was nervous, which is why it kind of like broke down, and even my questions got broken down. But Ms. Nakuset, thank you so much for taking the time out. I hope to speak to you again. And Native Lives Matter, power to the people, and let's hope that we both see the day where institutional racism is completely vanquished from this earth. So.
Yeah, let's try to do that. I think all your listeners can do something, like it's actionable. So yeah, challenge them. All right.
Keep doing the fantastic work you do. And once again, thank you so much. It was a real honor.
All right. Thank you.